I'm Jenny Klochko. You're watching my podcast, the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. Today, we discuss Olenivka prison massacre. This happened 3 years ago on 29th of July in 2022, when Russian forces, Russian army attacked one of the buildings of the prison on the occupied territory of Ukraine. There were prisoners from Ukraine, mainly they were from Azov regiment, and many people died then. The figures that we don't have exact figures, different sources, they're saying something killed between 53, 62 people and wounded between 75 and 130 people. So today, my guest, he's representative, he's a serviceman of Azov Regiment, and he's also was in that building. He survived, and we will discuss this tragedy through his eyes and his experience with Azov, his experience of defending Ukraine, because my guest, Genady Kharchenko, he joined armed forces. He started defending Ukraine in 2014 by himself, being translator, being historian, he's author, he has the book. I leave the link in the comment below this video so you can check. So let's hear his story, and please don't hesitate, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's go back and see what happened 3 years ago. Nadi, hello, how are you today?
Hello, I'm fine. I want to greet all our friends from Ukraine and from other countries. I am very happy to communicate with you and to speak about this topic.
Genady, where were you when the war broke out on February 24th, 2022? You are from Zaporizhia, right? How did it happen that you became one of the defenders of Mariupol?
I was a serviceman, a soldier of the Azov Regiment, and our base was located in Mariupol. We were preparing for an attack. It was obvious. When a massive army is conducting exercises near the border, when we constantly face military threats, when spies, spotters, or people working for military intelligence are discovered, it's clear that an attack from Russia was to be expected. We were selecting firing positions, conducting training, and preparing to repel a possible assault from Russia. So the start of the full-scale invasion began for me at the Azov military base in Mariupol. We heard powerful explosions as Russian forces began destroying nearby small towns and villages around Mariupol. There weren't even any military bases there. And I want to emphasize right away that both the city of Mariupol and those nearby towns and villages weren't just affected by the war or military aggression. They were deliberately destroyed. This war, this full-scale invasion, was designed to destroy cities, urban infrastructure, and urban populations above all else. The first shells and strikes didn't even hit our positions on the first day. Instead, they targeted civilian buildings, civil infrastructure, places where food supplies were kept, where people could get water. The very first thing destroyed was the city infrastructure. There was no gas, no electricity, and the city was pushed to the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe. At the same time, civilians were not allowed to leave the city. We had an order from our commander to hold the defense to the last. Not a single Azov fighter would have left the city without orders. Russian propaganda claimed we were using civilians as human shields. But in fact, both global leaders, the international community, and our command insisted on establishing humanitarian corridors so civilians could leave the city. As for us, I was an artilleryman. Our first shots and fire positions were directed at the Russian troops approaching the city. Initially, we were conducting anti-landing operations, positioning ourselves along the coast of the Sea of Azov, expecting an attack from the sea. But when enemy columns started advancing from Novoazovsk and Rostov, we repositioned our firing points. These positions were carefully chosen, and locals can confirm, in areas where there were no residential buildings or private homes. We were destroying Russian military columns advancing toward the city. So from the very beginning, it was about destruction, killing, genocide of civilians. From the very beginning, it was a massive lie that this was some kind of liberation, a humanitarian or peacekeeping mission. From the very first shots, shells were fired at residential buildings. It was a nightmare, something incomprehensible. Even when they left their columns without fire support, they continued shelling from aircraft, cannons, howitzers and mortars, primarily targeting civilian areas, destroying and killing civilians first, without even engaging in counter-battery fire against us. We were also shocked by the sheer number of Russian soldiers. At least speaking for myself, I thought the assault would stop, that it would be something like what happened near Kiev, where the enemy had to retreat after heavy losses. But despite enormous losses, they didn't stop, didn't care. And it's important to emphasize, as cannon fodder, the enemy used collaborators, the so-called fighters of the DNR People's Militia. So anyone who thinks that Russia will come and things will be better, let them count the cost right now. We already have that experience. The collaborators were mobilized and thrown in first, just like what's happening now. This is for those in Ukraine who still have illusions or hopes about a possible Russian invasion. This is hybrid warfare. We're dealing with propaganda under slogans like peace and reconciliation, with messages like, let someone stop this, let's have peace, let's just give up some territory. That won't bring peace. It will only provoke and encourage the aggressor to keep fighting, to keep killing. Just like now, as they disregard their losses, back then the Russian army advanced over its own corpses, moving closer and closer to Mariupol.
You say they specifically attacked civilians, but killing civilians is exactly what you were accused of when you were captured by the Russians and sentenced to 25 years. When all of that happened, didn't it feel completely surreal to you that they were literally accusing you of the very crimes they themselves committed? Or, in the overall picture of Russian lawlessness, did it not really stand out or seem particularly significant?
You know, Russian propaganda and Russian television news have been compared more than once, and rightfully so, to Orwell's book 1984. When war is peace, when lies are truth, and when lack of freedom is called liberty. In reality, everything is exactly the opposite. The Russians didn't even deny the destruction of the city or the killing of civilians, but they shifted the entire blame for the looting, the destruction, the killings, and the genocide onto Ukrainian soldiers, especially the fighters of the Azov regiment. Many Azov fighters had settled down, gotten married. Local girls married them, found partners among them. Many guys married local girls, had relationships. So to say that we were some sort of occupying force, that the city suffered under Azov, I just can't agree with that at all. On the contrary, every holiday, thousands of locals came out and sincerely thanked Azov. We invited them to our celebrations, and they invited us to theirs. There are plenty of photos left, not even from official sites, from city festivals, sea festivals, cultural events. And there were a lot of them in Mariupol. A huge number of creative events and cultural platforms took place there, even during COVID. It was incredibly vibrant and engaging, especially for the youth. Azov participated in many of these events, both in organizing and as participants. The city in no way looked like it was under occupation, and the people certainly didn't behave like they were suffering under Azov's presence. Even now, I still have to talk about this. You can just look through the archive photos and see how happy, how joyful that city was, how life there was thriving. In just a few years, the city had begun transforming into a modern, comfortable European city where it was truly pleasant to live, and the attitudes of the locals were changing. It's important to say that for a long time, the city had been depressed, heavily influenced by Russian and Soviet, and later very aggressive Russian propaganda. This idea that the dream of life was to work at Azovstal, breathe polluted air, drink 300 grams of vodka, rest in your garden during vacation, and then return to the factory. That your son and your grandson would do the same and never think of anything else. But life turned out to be colorful and diverse. You could listen to jazz, visit the theater, go to museums. For a long time, there weren't any truly interesting cultural events in Mariupol. But when festivals like Gogol Fest began to be held, a huge number of residents and youth supported it. Events organized by Vedja were incredibly creative, vibrant, and full of young people. On museum night, when 3 different museums hosted exhibitions, Ukrainian art, 19th century paintings, the works of Maria Primachenko, and Scythian gold, around 10,000 Mariupol residents attended in just one night. The city was growing, and what happened wasn't a liberation by the Russian army or the Putin regime. On the contrary, it was an attempt to crush this progress and destroy it. Because, as the Italian writer and statesman Matteo Levi once wrote, a place that has tasted freedom, that has experienced self-governance, can never again be conquered. The only way to subdue it is to destroy it. And I believe the Russians were acting exactly on that principle. Because even now, Mariupol residents, both those who left and those who stayed, feel nostalgia and remember that city, that growth, that atmosphere it once had.
I can only imagine, or maybe I can't even begin to imagine, the pain you must have felt seeing Mariupol destroyed once you had already relocated to Azovstal and were there before eventually ending up in Olenivka. Because those images, those videos, they're shocking. It's just hard to believe, especially when you see videos of Mariupol before, how it had been rebuilt, how beautiful and vibrant it was, and then suddenly it becomes this horrifying ghost, a monstrous ruin full of pain and death. When you got to Azovstal, how much of that destruction had already happened? At what point do you remember it?
Yes, of course. After we found ourselves completely surrounded, we began to feel a shortage of ammunition, especially mortar rounds and artillery shells. Due to the heavy workload, our artillery systems started to break down. We tried to repair them ourselves using parts from damaged guns and mortars, and did our best to conserve everything we had. Some ammunition was delivered, what we called airdrops, by helicopters. We stretched those supplies as far as possible, but because of the constant and intense fighting, that stockpile was quickly depleted. My crew and I eventually switched from howitzers to mortars. There was even a remarkable moment when we remembered that a World War II-era mortar was kept in the local history museum, and we used it in combat as a symbolic act to show who the real fascists were and who was truly defending the city. And yes, it actually worked. Well, the mortar itself didn't fire directly, but we used some of its components to repel the Russian aggression. It was an 82mm mortar. The guys who worked on it will remember this and can confirm it. It was more of a symbolic and historical gesture, but also very real and very powerful. Later, we were reassigned, first to observation duties, then transferred to infantry as the fighting intensified. This was already during street battles and defensive clashes at strongholds. I was wounded at one of those positions and taken to Azovstal. At that time, Azovstal housed the command post, a reserve post, and the field hospital known as Zalizniak, a name many people now recognize. Other support and logistic systems for the garrison and command were also there. By then, little by little, more and more troops were moving from the outer defensive positions into the Azovstal complex itself, and were taking up defensive positions there. It had become extremely difficult to hold the defensive lines at the original strongpoints, which frankly is a generous term. In reality, those were often destroyed houses, exposed to tank assaults and massive shelling from artillery and airstrikes. They weren't at all suited for combat. Many didn't even have shelters or basements. Still, we understood that by spreading out the front line as much as possible, we were helping ourselves by easing the pressure on each defensive position. Because no matter how large the Azovstal plant was, and no matter how strong the shelters seemed, concentrating everyone in one place would make it easier for the enemy to surround and isolate us, which was their strategic goal. Gradually, though, those shelters were being destroyed too. Until the official order came for everyone to fall back to Azovstal, we did everything we could to hold the city itself and maintain the defense from within.
Tell me, when you got to Azovstal, before Olenivka happened and before the extraction operation, did you ever have a moment? I mean, I'd like you to recall and share what you were thinking then. Were you thinking like a soldier or more like a man on a human level? Did you feel like this is it because you saw what was happening around you? Or did the historian in you take over and you thought, I'm in the very heart of hell where the history is unfolding. It's all happening before my eyes. I have to remember everything. Was it the human side or the historical awareness that dominated you?
You know, above all, there were people who, in one way or another, depended on me. There was the command, which expected and relied on us to carry out our combat tasks. There were my comrades, my subordinates, who directly depended on the decisions and actions made by my team, whether it was our unit or our defensive position. And there were civilians nearby too, people who came to us, sometimes pleading for help, sometimes even offering help. There were many cases like that. Even when food was running out, people would bring us homemade pastries or pancakes. I don't even know where they found the ingredients. Others would ask where they could go to get water or if we could share medical supplies. Some wanted to evacuate. There was one particularly touching moment at a stronghold called Niva, at the intersection of Jednosti Avenue and Taganrogska Street. A few families had come together, trying to leave, but they were uncertain and asked us for any information, any minimal guarantee, because any moving car could seem suspicious. The Russians were also demanding that civilians wear white rags, the same ones they used to mark their soldiers, and that vehicles be marked with them too. But for us, those white armbands were a sign of the enemy. That created serious risks, because a person seen from 500 meters away wearing a white band was perceived as a target, as a threat. The Russians knew this and deliberately provoked these situations. In fact, they even opened fire on civilians who didn't wear those markers. The front line was so fragmented, our firing position was just a few buildings away from the Russian strongpoint. One street was controlled by us, the next by them, then the next by us again. It was incredibly difficult to know which way was safe, which direction led toward Ukrainian-held territory, which to the occupied zone where the checkpoints were, or where the roads were mined. People told us that in the areas the Russians had already taken over, they had established a curfew. All men were either forcibly mobilized or immediately checked for tattoos. Tattoos were considered signs of affiliation with Azov. So when those families came, I advised them to leave as early as possible. Around 3 or 4 a.m., I radioed to all our defensive positions, informing them of the safe route and that civilians would be passing through and not to open fire. And then one woman came up to me, and she kissed me on the cheek so sincerely. It was incredibly moving. We all watched as those 3 cars, carrying several families, drove past our positions and then past the Russian ones. I hope they made it. I hope they're safe now, wherever they are.
When your commander, Denis Prokopenko, received the order from the president to surrender, it's known that some of the guys decided to stay behind. Some later made it to Ukrainian-controlled territory. Some lived off threats to survive. You have surely heard these stories. Many of them are now well known in Ukraine. At that moment, the Russians promised one thing under the terms of the agreement, but they didn't keep their word. They tortured people. And many of your brothers and sisters in arms from Azov still haven't returned home. Do you remember how you made your own decision in that moment? Because you could have chosen to stay to avoid captivity and prison and everything that followed. But what were the chances of surviving? When you were already so exhausted, you were drinking radiator water, and there was no food. These stories are horrifying. And the photo of you, the one that was published in media around the world, what were you thinking then? Why did you decide to come out and not stay behind?
Ви знаєте, ми також вже в полоні чули про ці
You know,
історії
even while we were already in captivity, we
хлопців,
heard
жінок,
these
які
stories,
потім
call
зібрали
signs of the guys who stayed behind
е,
and then managed to reach
контрольованої
Ukrainian-controlled
території. І,
territory.
звісно, хто
And
був
of course,
складно
no matter what anyone
налаштований
said, we
різні
discussed and
ситуації,
worked through
мабуть,
various
для себе,
possible scenarios.
вибачте, я навіть такий жарт згадав, на большому воздушному шарі я сібуся за Азовсталі.
Probably everyone had their own thoughts. Excuse me, I even remembered a joke that I would escape Azovstal in a big hot air balloon. We even sang and joked about all sorts of possible situations, swimming across the Sea of Azov, crossing the Kalmius River, sneaking out in small groups, moving at night, breaking through, trying to get to the nearest Ukrainian units. It was absolutely a possibility. Of course, it was discussed. However, you know, hope was preserved until the very end. There was absolutely no despair. This was truly a situation of hope, confidence in our own strength. Also, Redis behaved very honorably at that time. He took full responsibility for the situation and the negotiations. And the negotiations were not only with the general staff or the president, but also with the Russians. They began negotiations in early May, but we didn't know about it. There was no information leakage, no rumors or gossip. Later, the command post moved to the bunker where I was located. Naturally, I observed the commander's actions. It was extremely difficult because the Russians constantly violated the ceasefire, repeatedly breaking all agreements. Regarding the evacuation of civilians, the Russians claimed there were no civilians in Azovstal and that Azov was using civilians as human shields. Even before negotiations about the further fate of Azov fighters in those extremely difficult conditions, the primary concern was saving the civilians, and then the critically wounded brothers in the Zaliziak hospital. The hospital was in a terrible state. There was a lack not only of equipment, but also of medicine. Operations were conducted in extremely difficult conditions. We ran to Zaliziak under fire. They took blood donations for transfusions, even from wounded people, using improvised and impossible makeshift devices. Medical tools were replaced with ordinary ones in some cases. Many of the fighters lost consciousness, running to Azovstal because they had no strength left, but they insisted on giving blood. I remember the example of a girl with blood group O positive. She ran under fire at night as well. This was when Putin had beautifully declared to Shoigu and the whole world that the assault on Azovstal was stopping. But the assault never stopped. Shelling continued day and night. At night, illuminating mines lit the area, and even the slightest movement was met with fire, a methodical bombardment. Strategic bombings also took place at night. They told the girl it would be better to take blood from men and that she probably wouldn't be needed. But she went with that group anyway, ready to sacrifice herself and her life to save her comrades. There were many such cases, a huge display of genuine courage, brotherhood, and support. This whole atmosphere stemmed from Redis. When I saw him, he was barely recognizable, a powerful, athletic man who had lost a lot of weight because he was in command 24/7. It was unclear when he could rest. He constantly moved from one bunker to another, went out to the positions, and negotiating was difficult not only with our command, but probably even more difficult with the Russians, especially since the Russians constantly broke all promises and guarantees. Yet Redis took full responsibility for the situation. I never heard him say, "I was ordered," or "I have to follow this order." Even if it was an order, it was one he accepted as a commander and presented to us as his own decision. This is the kind of commander who can motivate by example, even in such a difficult situation. Also, it was very touching and sincere to celebrate the anniversary of Azov on May 5th at Azovstal. Usually these events were triumphant and grand, remembering the fallen, the formation, the Black Corps, the Black Rides, the glory and missions in Berdyansk while Azov was still active. It was an incredible celebration. Compared to previous years, this anniversary was completely different. Many comrades had died, and the future was uncertain. The Russians were already showing the regional philharmonic, saying they were preparing a hall for a tribunal. It reminded me of the Donetsk airport story, when defenders were destroyed by aerial bombs and the rest captured for shameful ideological purposes. Despite everything, there was still a festive atmosphere. The most Redis could do was come up, hug the oldest warrior, who was about 70 years old, and greet everyone. It really felt like a genuine, sincere celebration. That atmosphere of military brotherhood, confidence in our own strength and leadership, and the hope that the situation would be resolved somehow, it outweighed all the ideological noise and attempts by the enemy to influence us and civilians. For example, our gunner with the call sign Tsoy, who is ethnically Korean but speaks Ukrainian fluently and is a true patriot and comrade, sometimes received messages from the occupiers on the radio connection, which they managed to turn on temporarily. We joked about it. He'd get a message like, "Russians, wait, we'll free you soon, Akhmat's strength." And I got messages like, "Foreign Legion surrender." We joked about how unfair that was. Why should he surrender while I was supposed to be freed? Even the enemy's ideological pressure was used for jokes and mutual support. This true atmosphere, even when there was nothing left except to hug and shake hands, outweighed all the enemy's ideological weapons. We believed more and celebrated May 5th, the founding day of Azov, more than we succumbed to ideological pressure around May 9th.
When on May 16th, 2022, Azov civilians, the wounded, were leaving Azovstal and ended up in Olenivka, I remember honestly, I felt happy. Now I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit it, but I was happy because I was afraid they would kill you all. Do you understand? And those last weeks, the last days when your commanders were doing live broadcasts, speaking directly to foreign audiences, asking for support, because, as you mentioned, there were already different options for evacuation. And when they were leaving and getting on those buses that were taking you, do you remember what you were thinking? And what was the range of emotions like? How did they change once you arrived in Olenivka?
Так, звичайно. Ну, скажімо, що ведуться певні перемовини,
Yes,
і
of course.
що
Well, we knew that
є певні
negotiations were
документи, які
underway
давали
and that there
ознаки,
was some hope.
і, скажімо, ну, навіть заяви тоді політиків, що буде досягнуто рішення, яке
We felt
потенційно
that right
можливе,
away.
але це
Even
єдине
politicians' statements
можливе в
at the
даній
time
ситуації.
saying that a
Але
decision would be
інформація, мова
reached,
йде
one
десь
that wouldn't
про
satisfy
кілька
everyone,
варіантів
but
виходу,
was perhaps the only option in the situation.
Так
We
само,
already guessed that it involved some kind of
є
evacuation.
бачення і
But to
заяви
the Russian side,
лідерів, як духовних, так і політичних, вони, звичайно, давали певну впевненість. Але
the
насамперед,
global
скажімо,
attention from the world community,
ряді
including
свідчень,
Eurovision
як
and
можуть бути
statements
певні
from world
наслідки,
leaders, both
і
spiritual and political, certainly gave some confidence. But above all, again, Redis personally visited every bunker where our fighters were and personally delivered the order to each one, explaining how we were to surrender, that we were destroying all documents, all military equipment, medical equipment, so the enemy couldn't use them, that the fight would not stop, that we were destroying medical devices. Also, then we would destroy as much of the Azov symbols as possible, so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. But our flags would be preserved. This was very important for us. We were also allowed to leave with our weapons. We surrendered them, not to the Russians directly, but by placing them on a truck that was there. It was even said that these weapons would be returned to Ukraine. We were also given the opportunity to send some personal belongings, small packages, home for safekeeping, which we would later receive. Also, Redis asked, at least in the bunker where I was, if we could take a small supply of food with us into captivity. There were also 2 dogs kept in our bunker. One of them was the legendary Adig. They even mentioned not leaving anyone behind. Redis even took part in separate negotiations regarding these dogs to ensure they could be evacuated as well. There was a dachshund in another bunker. This was a very touching and humane attitude. The story of Adik is no less impressive than any fighter's story. His stay, his attitude. Because his owner, Valkyrie, still has her husband and son in captivity, but Adik is like a family member now free. He even managed to be in Olenivka and got close to Kadyrov, who did not appreciate his affection and was scared of him. It was funny when Russian propagandists tried to downplay this episode, saying, "He was scared of you." But it was clear who was actually scared of whom. You could see Adik's reaction to Kadyrov and his reaction to Valkyrie when he was returned from captivity.
So, what did you feel when you were leaving? On one hand, it was hope for life, but on the other hand, not really hope for life.
Yes, hope for life, and it was not the capitulation. That it wasn't some chaotic emergency where everyone was just trying to save themselves, but everything was coordinated. At least we were doing it according to a plan, following certain lists, moving to specific points, having at least some understanding of what was going on. Given the conditions, I think this was the only real way to save the lives of the entire Mariupol garrison. Also, the fact that the commander personally delivered and explained this order, answered all the questions, and assured us that our belongings would get to Ukraine, that was important. We understood that we were preserving our lives, preserving the life of the unit. Although, again, these things were later seen by me at the Donetsk guardhouse. Also, the supplies never made it to Olenivka. The Russians looted them as well. This again shows how the Russians keep their word, or rather don't. Even the supplies taken out from Azov Stal and brought to Olenivka were looted, or rather not even properly guarded, so they were stolen. Not only the city, but also personal belongings that the fighters had kept or intended to take with them. There was almost nothing left. Similarly, the commander gave orders to take all documents with us, to fully provide information to help establish contacts. The more personal information you give, the faster you would be identified by both sides, and the sooner you would be exchanged. And also, Redis took full responsibility on himself. There was never any "I was told," "I was promised," or "I was ordered." It was always clear, "I am ordering according to my command, only in this way." Although everyone understood and knew that this decision was coordinated primarily with the headquarters and the president.
What did you feel when you arrived at Olenivka? You personally saw it, since the prison was basically mothballed, and then some of those who came out of Azovstal with you said, "It feels like we were the first wave of people brought there." Do you remember the barracks were in terrible condition? Nothing was repaired at all. And overall, the Russians, who used Azovstal for so many years, were barely any better than the worst demons you could imagine. And here you are, lots of you, completely at their mercy. What emotions did you have? I'm interested in your personal emotional experience, the full range of how you felt.
Well, at first, the place was absolutely unsuitable for holding prisoners. It really was. There was nothing there. No water supply, no gas supply. The bakery that used to be there wasn't working. It had long ago been looted and ruined. It was a former juvenile detention colony. We even joked at first that the military system was being restored because the question arose whether everyone was just on their own, or if the prison's own rules applied, the ones Russia was imposing on us. And strangely enough, the internal prison world is somehow absolutely identical to the so-called Russian democracy. The two highest careers in Russian society are either being a thief in law, a criminal authority, or a politician, or someone important in the security services. When we were interrogated, they asked if we had any criminal connections or if our relatives did. We said no. They said, "How not? You are punk kids. You were recruited to Azov. You chose to go there." But our selection was based on completely different criteria: self-awareness, physical condition, combat experience. Even in normal civilian life, for someone to develop and exist in society, they often need some corrupt official, some corrupt cop, a crooked policeman, or a thief in law to help fix things. Out of those three essential parts of normal Russian existence, the most respectable is the thief-in-law because he has some principles. But we don't have any of those. Ask anyone, famous athletes, writers, journalists, soldiers. Everyone can name someone they know who is a known criminal or thief-in-law and who filled out questionnaires after getting sentences. We don't have that. Prison for us is a tragedy, something people don't take pride in. Unlike in the 90s when, sorry, every guy wanted to be a racketeer and every girl wanted to be a prostitute. That was a product of living in the Soviet Union and the cultural values of that time. We've completely changed since then. They really didn't understand how it's possible to live in society, rebuild business, have a career without knowing the right people, without connections, and without understanding why you need bribes or those criminal thieves or fixers. That was not interesting to us, and they were really surprised by this. Not accepting the criminal world, we restored military hierarchy, within units, within barracks, with commanders for each barrack and each unit. Information was passed through them, meetings were held, orders given, and this largely made life easier. To organize those who hadn't yet, to wash clothes, to clean up a bit, even though there was nothing, no water, no hygiene supplies, no soap, nothing basic. Still, we found ways to look decent. When journalists or propagandists arrived, they filmed us a lot. These are the shots that, by the way, I was in. Reuters journalists filmed us. Russians did not film or post it. Sometimes a camp leader gave interviews while we stood silently behind, showing clearly that this was a military unit, that the guys were holding themselves with dignity in those conditions, wearing the clothes they came out in, keeping their heads held high, standing straight, and looking more or less neat. There was a very interesting incident later in Olenivka, during an interrogation when I was brought with a group of my comrades and guarded not only by inspectors but also by special forces. One special forces soldier was called away for his own business. The rotation in Olenivka was ending. He asked my comrade Puklov, his call sign, because Puklov looked so neat and carefully maintained his appearance that a soldier didn't even realize he was a prisoner. They said, "Hey, watch this tough guy for me. The headquarters is calling me now." And Puklov replied, "It's no trouble, but I'm only watching this tough guy because we're from the same gang." Foreign correspondents filmed us as much as they could, but Russian propagandists hardly filmed us, and we hardly saw any footage from them. The footage that does exist, like when we left Azovstal, shows everything happening clearly, helping women, helping prisoners, carrying the seriously wounded, carrying the belongings of those who struggled, helping those who had difficulty walking. We behaved with dignity during searches. Those scenes are almost nowhere to be found, and the lines spoken by Russian propagandists were completely opposite to what really happened. So despite the harsh conditions and lack of even minimally suitable living conditions or hygiene supplies, we remembered above all that we were soldiers and had to take care of ourselves and our comrades nearby.
Recently, your commander Kalina gave a big interview. He talked about when everyone ended up in prison, and he used certain prison methods conveyed to everyone not to let that criminal prison ideology and order infiltrate you, and you have to preserve your brotherhood. And this interview was very long. I'm glad he did it because it needed to be told, that story. And I think, my God, so much is happening. Not only you're a commander, but you're also a person. Yet still, how important it was for all of you not to lose yourself as one whole Azov. And what was the reaction of the Russians to this fierce demonic Azov? Did they interrogate you differently? It was clear that some kind of spirit of Azov was present or completely absent. Or how did they behave with you?
Of course, it was felt. Of course, they had a separate procedure, inspection and photographing of tattoos. At first, well, it was kind of like a show. If you had offered Russian officers to go to a concert by someone like, I don't know, Gazmanov, or to look at the tattoos of Azov soldiers, I think they would even have paid money for that. It was just an incredible, wild frenzy. But when they started seeing what was depicted and how it was depicted, we also had a lot is said about this. And again, there are few refutations. Often the narrative is picked up that someone saw some right-wing tattoos or tattoos with forbidden symbols on Azov soldiers. So that became a source of propaganda. First of all, I can say there is a technique to tattooing, how to do it, where to do it. And it was a sign of our subculture, which remains a symbol of our subculture. Now it has spread similarly both in the military and many other Azov traditions. And say, those who were in Azov for a long time had the right to ask whether it was okay to get a tattoo or not. These were unofficial rules for those who had been in the regiment for a long time, or to advise where one could get a tattoo and which master could do it. So, of course, there were any kinds of unsuccessful tattoos. There were also ones that the Russians liked to show. But again, that's just complete nitpicking of facts. In recent years in Azov, this was very important to us. Well, I can't say it was encouraged, but it was somewhat a sign of the Azov subculture. And so again, the huge, absolutely insane amount of tattoos, and the explanations of why a tattoo was placed, what each design means, what it means personally to you, whether from Slavic, Scandinavian, or Ukrainian mythology. This amazed the Russians so much that they soon stopped coming around. Because they saw high-quality tattoos and clear, fully justified explanations of why these tattoos were made and what they signified. But again, those investigators conducting actions regarding Azov weren't interested in the history of Azov, or combat experience, or training. From the beginning, they said they were oriented to find or, well, invent evidence that Azov is a theoretical anti-Semitic neo-Nazi organization that is banned and should be banned. Though again, let's look, just like Kyiv was taken in 3 days, we had full access to all Azov databases in Urzuf, Mariupol, Urivka, to documents, interrogations of almost all surviving Azov members, gathering evidence of terrorist activity, anti-Semitism, or Nazism in the movement, ideology, or worldview. None of that was proven. A few tattoos and images were selected by Russian ideologists, a very powerful apparatus, to conduct investigations, gather and extract evidence. They have developed these methods thoroughly. Also, like elements of criminal culture, when back in Stalin's time, intellectuals and criminals were prosecuted under the same article, Article 57, Parts A and B, and criminal structures were considered socially close. They even called themselves that. We were surprised this attitude hasn't changed. Those who reject the life of prison laws, the investigators themselves, and Russian society as a whole, live and sing the same songs, use the same jokes, make the same tattoos, which glorify this culture, which they call AUE, criminal subculture. It was quite strange that on the same stage, the same culture is preached by both investigators and murderers, rapists, and society accepts this as a kind of honor. I don't know, probably the Oscars aren't celebrated as much as attention is paid to Mikhail Krug and others, even though it is really very low quality, low creativity stuff. Still, it is constantly aired on state channels and promoted as socially close, because submission and those concepts are the foundation of modern Russian society. So not to take this all at face value as ideology, that's what we learned and cultivated in Azov. The spirit of brotherhood, which truly allowed us to survive and preserve ourselves personally, the unit, and grow from a former battalion to a regiment, and now a corps. Have the Russians succeeded? No, not at all. Likewise, many Azov members have moved to other units, and the traditions that were and are there have also passed on and survived there. So not to take this all at face value as ideology, that's what we learned and cultivated in Azov. The spirit of brotherhood, which truly allowed us to survive and preserve ourselves personally, the unit, and grow from a former battalion to a regiment, and now a corps. Have the Russians succeeded? No, not at all. Likewise, many Azov members have moved to other units, and the traditions that were and are there have also passed on and survived there.
Look, this Russian propaganda against Azov, the demonization of Azov, has actually been very effective since 2014. I mean, outside of Ukraine, and even back in 2022, when I was producing documentary for a British TV channel, and Azov and its symbols were mentioned, the director would grab his head, jump out, and say, "God, no Azov, no symbols, no, no that." And no explanations or clarification could change his mind. He simply didn't want to hear anything about Azov. But the truth is, the governments apologized. The Japanese government apologized to Azov. The US lifted its ban on using certain weapons. So we overcame their effectiveness. It took many years, but it is now acknowledged, and their demonization no longer exists for the global community. Please, tell me more so we can talk about the tragedy that happened. Do you remember the night before? Because I listened to testimonies from various prisoners who were there. The evening before the tragedy, what was happening? Do you remember your feelings? Maybe that sense that something was being prepared, that something was not right, something different than usual. Tell me about it.
You know, the feeling that something was being prepared, that something was going to happen, that feeling really only came after it happened, when we started analyzing what had taken place. If any of the guys say, "I predicted it, I knew, I warned," well, I can say probably not. It's just psychological reflection. For example, the fact that there wasn't enough space in the barracks where we were held. Those barracks were designed for a maximum of 60 or 70 people. In that Dobovia barrack, there were 333. Some guys even had to live outside in the yard because there was no space to sleep inside the sleeping quarters. Everyone was ordered to sleep exclusively inside the new building. I can't even call it a barrack. It was a former industrial workshop in an abandoned industrial zone. We weren't allowed to stay in the yard after lights out. That evening, we all started discussing, even through command and organizational forms, to request the administration to allow lights out not at 10 p.m., but at 11. First, because it was very hot in the summer and it was impossible to sleep. The barracks were overheated. It was cooler in the evening, and people wanted to talk or walk a bit around what was called the local area, the yard. Nobody really wanted to sleep at 10 p.m. yet. As soldiers, we still followed the administration's order. But that same evening, we were still discussing which time was better for lights out, 10 or 11. Also, the evening before the explosion, I was holding an English lesson with the guys, and I approached Lemko. He was the mortar battery commander then. Now he is the chief of staff. I asked for permission to hold the lesson, for some chalk, and for a separate room. There was a separate room on the second floor, because there was a large gathering to hold the class. There was also a sign, which you might have seen. It remained probably the only undamaged artifact, showing an inventory list with the number 193. I noticed an error on the list and pointed it out to Lemko. He said, "Well, just take it and fix it." So I did. Later, the Russians showed this sign and said, "See, there are mistakes written here." No, 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 there are no mistakes. You're lying again, because when I asked for chalk, I noticed the mistake and corrected it. We held the English lesson on the second floor. Besides lessons, we also posted a calendar of events for August on a big wall, marking Kharkiv Day, Ukrainian Flag Day, and Independence Day. The calendar was in Ukrainian, just like the sign. We were assuming we would be there for at least a month, hence the calendar. Why we were transferred there and why we were there, no one knew or had any guess. Everyone hoped it was some kind of exchange preparation. But even with those expectations, the idea seemed fantastic, unbelievable. Another detail, that was the only barrack near which the order was given to the Marines guarding the prisoners to prepare defenses. Azov fighters were not involved in preparing the place where they would be kept. Near that barrack alone, a trench was dug for the guards. There were no trenches near any other barracks. Also, whenever some repair work was going on, electricians or others came in, we were always forced inside and never had a chance to observe or even be outside while the work was being done. Repairs in Olenivka were happening very slowly. The administration there was pushing the workers very hard. The investigations were ongoing, but there was no particular deadline for the investigators. The guys from that barrack were called for interrogations in the evening. It seemed urgent to get testimonies, but nothing happened that day. The interrogations were postponed to the next day or week. Initially, the Russian Investigative Committee, FSB, and intelligence were not in a hurry with investigative actions. However, the prisoners in that barrack were urgently summoned for evening interrogations. When we had been in the colony for some time and some sanitary zones and food arrangements were set up, we noticed that this new barrack was built completely without considering experience. It felt more like some decorative pavilion for filming than an attempt to make living quarters for at least 200 people. As you know, regarding the accusations, that's Russian propaganda, which is quite effective because it uses brazen, cynical lies. The bolder and more cynical the lie, the more trust it gains. Goebbels noted this, and maybe it's a topic for psychologists to study. Still, if the Ukrainian forces or government wanted to kill their prisoners, they would have shelled the barracks that still had most of the guys inside. I'm not even sure if our commanders or intelligence even knew that we had been transferred, because the transfer happened just one day before the barrack caught fire. People ask why they blew up that particular barrack. I'm absolutely sure it was that one. Why not one of the other barracks where we were held? The reason is simple. The weapon used was thermobaric, and I'm more convinced of this every day. It was very hot in those premises, and initially the administration allowed us not only to open windows, but to remove window panes and frames entirely, saying you can take out the frames, but you have to keep them intact and put them back later. We had very skilled guys who made chess and backgammon sets out of nothing, with incredible craftsmanship despite having no tools. So naturally the heat was unbearable, especially in the summer in that city. And at least there was some ventilation because windows were opened or even taken out with their frames.
Why is it important before the attack, the presence or absence of these window frames?
And in that barrack, of course, it was a fully enclosed space. There were not really windows, but openings just enough for some light to get in. The whole room was closed off. Also, if you think about the epicenter of the explosion, it was closer to the wall, closer to the exit. Why was that? Again, for exactly the same reason. The formation of the destructive blast wave was most effective there because it was an enclosed space. In that barrack, there were large industrial machines, huge machines left over from the times when that place was actually used as an industrial facility. And you know, that whole zone was neglected. Everything was broken down. Everything was stolen. Absolutely everything. But for some reason, those very machines were filled with oil. That's quite strange, right? In a zone that hasn't been used for a long time, oil somehow appeared, and this oil quickly exploded. So I think it didn't just appear by accident. It was fresh oil. You could tell it was fresh. It appeared right before the incident. If nobody was planning anything, because the machines themselves had only their frame left, why would someone fill a machine with oil if they weren't planning to use it? First, it's expensive. Second, everything was scarce there. Toothpaste, toothbrushes, soap. So where did that much oil come from? This is also a pretty strange question. When the explosion happened, it was quite strange that usually we didn't sleep at 10 p.m. Absolutely not. From the 333 people in the barrack, it was very rare if 3 people were already asleep by 11 p.m. More than half of the guys were outside, talking, wandering, socializing. Some were even doing physical exercises at that time because it wasn't so hot. For example, our scouts would try to exercise near the window, showing off to everyone that nothing could stop them. Some guys would walk, run, do push-ups, or other physical exercises then. But mostly, people were still outside. At 11 p.m., everyone was supposed to be asleep. That never happened in the days before. And in fact, not everyone woke up immediately after the first explosion. Many of the guys woke up only after the second explosion, even though the explosions were incredibly powerful and loud. This caused some confusion over how many explosions there were. Was it 1 or 2, or one after another? That was also strange because it was during sleeping time.
When it all started, when the explosions began, did you wake up?
Yes, everyone was asleep. Only the duty guard at the entrance wasn't asleep, but he was inside the building as well. There was an incredibly powerful explosion, an unbelievably strong noise that tore the roof open. Burnt beams and some burnt metal structures of the roof were falling down. The roof was also covered with some kind of fiberglass insulation material, which caught fire and fell too. There were screams, moans, and chaos. Then a second explosion occurred. Nobody could understand what was happening. Another blast echoed. Metal objects flew through the air. Hot insulation materials flew as well. I immediately rushed to my neighbor's bunk. We were good friends, played on the battalion football team together, talked, and even laid next to each other while studying English. He was a very strong, physically fit guy who always cared about sports. He was dead. I was sleeping separately from most of the guys from my mortar battery. I ran to them. Everyone was dead, or at least severely wounded. Very few survived. I was very surprised because when a mortar shell, artillery shell, or rocket hits, usually most of the damage is shrapnel wounds. Here, those who were injured died immediately. They tried to raise the turret, but he was dead. I tried to get up from the bed or lift those who had fallen to the floor. They were dead. Neither rockets, nor mortars, nor artillery shells can cause such an instant and effective impact, even when hitting a large group of people. I say this from personal experience. Then someone shouted, "Let's carry out the wounded." We started to look around, and the seriously wounded were much fewer than the guys who died immediately. Usually, it's the opposite. There are many more wounded than dead, even when a military group is hit directly. Then one of the guys shouted, "Let's carry out the dead." That was a reasonable idea because, for example, in Azov, there was always respect for the dead, for the fallen. Even when discussing the exchange of prisoners, we were told civilians would be released first, then the wounded, then women, then the dead, or sometimes the dead, then women. Nobody ever questioned why the dead should be taken out first. They risked their lives to take out the dead, and there were special trailers with refrigerators for storing bodies. During the Olenivka explosion, the first shout was to carry out the wounded. The second shout was to carry out the dead. The third shout was when some guys grabbed personal belongings, and others told them to stop and help the wounded instead. One or two who remained grabbed the stuff, but everyone else started carrying out the dead guys. The footage of the piled-up bodies that circulated worldwide was of the guys we carried out. This was not the team cleaning up afterward. Russian propaganda claimed those were wounded, left by Azov who were denied help. Absolute lies. We were carrying out our dead brothers, hoping to evacuate and bury them properly. Then the fire spread very quickly. The room was very small for so many people. The beds were packed tightly side by side, passages were blocked, and the lubricant caught fire. Besides mattresses, there was nothing else in the wards. For a mine, shell, or rocket to ignite such a fire on impact, it would have to catch mattresses on fire. I have no experience with that. We were hit many times in dugouts, barracks, and enemy troop concentrations, but a fire starting immediately and burning mattresses. No, that didn't happen. The fire started. We began to get out. The explosion blew out the doors, and the barbed wire was hastily constructed, but we managed to break through.
Ми вже виносили загиблих побратимів і клали їх в надії, що вдасться їх і вивезти, і вдасться їх гідно поховати. І вже потім почали, бо пожежа, полум'я дуже швидко поширювався, дуже маленьке приміщення для такої кількості людей, дуже щільно стояли ці ліжка один біля одного, проходи були закриті, і спалахнуло це мастило загально, хоча там, крім матрасів, палати було нічому. Знов таки, щоб від прильоту міни, снаряду, ракети спалахнули ті самі матраси, я не знаю. У мене такого досвіду не було. Ми неодноразово влучали і в бліндажі, і влучали і в бараки, і в місця скупчення окупантів, але щоб одразу здіймалася пожежа і одразу починалося горіти матраси, ні, такого не було. Все починає палати. Починаємо виходити, від вибуху вибило двері, а, скажімо, колючий дріт, він був настільки на швидкоруч збудований, що його вдалося прорвати. І я отримав осколкові поранення, кілька великих, кілька дрібних осколків.
I received several shrapnel wounds, some large, some small. There was also an episode with my friend Karas, who lay nearby. We were good friends. He told me, "Friend, I know you'll crack. Lie down on your side, please."
Ті уламки, які прилетають, вони прилетають в спину. І, чесно кажучи, я не відчуваю болю, я відчуваю навпаки. Якусь таку розслабленість, якусь таку радість, якусь...
I did, and the shrapnel hit my back. Honestly, I didn't feel pain. Instead, I felt a kind of relaxation, joy, almost euphoria. I realized it was unnatural, bleeding. I had burns and shrapnel wounds, but somehow I felt good and didn't want to move. Trying to overcome this calm, euphoric state, I forced myself to help others exit through a narrow passage. I went out alone first, just to catch my breath. Then everyone else organized and started moving. This was the direction toward the so-called residential area, where the administration was located, to provide aid to the wounded comrades. The reaction of the Russian administration was surprising. Near the colony, there were several roads used by the enemy for troop movements. Explosions sometimes sounded nearby, and every time the administration, inspectors and special forces were very scared. They limited movement, put on special gear, and tried to hide. But here, a massive explosion happened right on the colony territory, and they behaved calmly, arrogantly, cynically, completely unlike their usual reactions when there were distant explosions. First, we heard automatic gunfire into the air. The colony head came out, special forces appeared. We were ordered to stop moving. At first, we were told to move from the road to the lawn, then back to the road. Even these small movements were very painful for the seriously wounded. Each time we obeyed, pleading for medical aid, because all Azov soldiers are trained in first aid. Stop heavy bleeding, bandage wounds. Everyone knows how to do that. We also asked for doctors to have access, shouted to our paramedics, because we relied on them most in that situation. The response was complete silence. They drank coffee, surprised they managed to brew it already. They calmly watched comrades die, heard cries for help, but remained indifferent. The reaction was strange. If someone watched a movie, they might have shown more emotion than the Russian special forces and administration did. They were more concerned that we wouldn't rush at them or break the fence separating us. But in those conditions, that was irrelevant. It was about saving the wounded's lives. For hours, we got no help. Then a few old sheets and some outdated Soviet bandages were thrown in. Of course, it wasn't enough. Around 4 a.m., our doctors and paramedics were allowed in. They triaged us, even marking faces with green dye to show who needed immediate evacuation, who could wait, and who was light enough to assist others. When the medics arrived, I returned to the barracks. Although it was summer and hot, it was getting cooler, and the guys had run out in whatever they wore. No one took anything with them. I wanted to see what caused the explosion. I was surprised. Everything was burned out. I found a few t-shirts not near the entrance, but nearby. Someone had taken them off, and I took them to the guys.
пропагандисти демонстрували від хаймерсів і от 300% на чому завгодно. На Торі, на Біблії.
I carefully inspected the barracks. All the fragments Russian propagandists later showed as from HIMARS, I can swear on anything. Torah, Bible, Constitution, Press Bible. They definitely were not there at 3 a.m. There were no craters or pits that appear from rocket, mine, or shell hits at that spot, which Russians showed later as evidence.
Коли ми фіксували, скажімо, влучання чи, скажімо, свою роботу на тих позиціях, куди ми заходили пізніше, ми фіксували завжди, скажімо, уламки на тому місці, як воно прилетіло.
When we documented hits or our work on positions we entered later, we always recorded the fragments at the exact impact sites. Russians themselves carried out investigations. The location of these fragments was never documented at the barracks because, again, at 3 a.m., there were no HIMARS fragments. There were a few large fragments in me. Some guys pulled out a few immediately. I hid them because their structure didn't look like mines or shells. I hid some later at the hospital where I was taken and kept smaller fragments from myself. I managed to hide a dictionary that was in my pants pocket. Unfortunately, when we left, the dictionary was confiscated as evidence to prove it wasn't HIMARS or artillery, because the first version mentioned HIMARS rockets. The first thing said to us at the hospital was from the commander of the Genady Battalion Guard. Well, American artillery shoots well. He tried to butcher Ukrainian to intimidate us. This was definitely not fragments from mines, shells, or rockets.
Genady, what would you like people who are watching us right now in different countries on the different continents to know and remember about the tragedy in Olenivka?
I would like to address the relatives of those who died and those who are in captivity, because again, all these people are emotionally and morally exhausted, burnt out. Also, Russian propaganda continues to influence these groups of people, trying to sow discord, trying to pit prisoners against each other. For example, relatives of the Marine infantry, Azov fighters, the infantry themselves, the Azov fighters, saying that your command isn't doing anything. Your command forgot about you, the comrades who were released forgot about you. You are not needed by anyone. Your children, relatives, loved ones, husbands died for nothing. Well, this is absolutely untrue. For example, the t-shirt I'm wearing, yes, this t-shirt, which was given to me in the colony.
Show it, show your face. Oh, now your face. Well, of course, now with the face, we see the t-shirt. And now everything is fine. Here it is. It was good.
Here it is. It was good. This t-shirt was given to me by the Azov comrades in the colony. There was constant communication. Unfortunately, I can't talk about all the actions that took place when I was in captivity and those being done now by the regiment's command regarding the prisoners and their relatives. The work for release has been and is ongoing. Support is ongoing. When the first parcels were allowed, this was already after at least 2 years, comrades began to send such a quantity of goods that even the guards themselves, the Russian special forces, jokingly called it a closed club of millionaires. They were also told that no one remembers the Azov fighters, no one respects them. Their government betrayed them. In Ukraine, they are still recognized as criminals. Everyone forgot about them. And when the first parcels, first packages came in, the administration workers saw the quality and contents of these parcels and said that we cannot afford so much as these scoundrels receive. And this came from people who forgot and cursed them. Support is especially important for these people. Those whose relatives, children, husbands, brothers are in captivity, they are not forgotten. There are still difficulties. The main one is, of course, that Russia has never been a democratic or lawful country, and appealing to Geneva Conventions or other international agreements is futile. The war itself confirms that Russia despises and disregards all possible international agreements. All negotiations and ceasefire regimes have been completely violated. Since the war started in 2014, since the summer of 2014, the Russians, even when they requested a ceasefire, even when we were evacuating wounded or civilians, even when they asked for a truce to retrieve their dead, they did not do so. Instead, they carried out tactical moves, repositioned, took new positions, and resumed shelling and assaults constantly.
And what would you like people in other countries to remember about Olenivka tragedy?
First of all, I would like to thank the people in other countries because in talking with them, I feel that they perceive both our war and the tragedy in Olenivka as their own pain. Their help and support in this war mean a lot. Above all, I want to sincerely thank them for their attention and support. Also, it's important to understand that this is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's not simply an occupation of Ukraine by Russia. This is a war of the last evil empire, a totalitarian regime against the entire civilized world. Olenivka is precisely a manifestation of the fact that human life, the lives of prisoners, signed agreements, democratic values, and humanitarian principles mean nothing to the Russians.
What kind of justice do you expect from international organizations such as UN, the Red Cross, or possibly other international courts after what Russians did in Olenivka?
The Russians immediately invited international representatives and then immediately forbade them entry. They did what they usually do. Therefore, expecting any kind of justice, impartiality, objectivity, or even the possibility of cooperation with international organizations is impossible. Many criticize both the UN and the Red Cross for their inability to ensure rights, conduct investigations, or impose sanctions against Russia. First of all, I can say, having seen the situation from both sides, that all international institutions, the OSCE, the UN, and even NATO, are ineffective under the current circumstances. It is impossible to reach an agreement with the aggressor, with a dictator. No matter how much we want to understand it, there is no diplomatic solution to this war. This war must end exclusively with Russia's defeat, military defeat, but also through diplomatic, economic, and political pressure and stricter, more decisive sanctions. Likewise, there must be defense of the rights of prisoners of war, efforts to ensure access to them and their families, and access for representatives of international organizations. Similarly, the global community must react by changing these systems, changing the balance, where a country responsible for starting World War II is one of the leading members of the UN. A country that is an aggressor is one of the active members of the UN. Even the League of Nations, which was weak and indecisive, managed to exclude the Soviet Union after its occupation of Finland. The fact that Finland lost part of its sovereignty, Karelia, did not stop ambitions. The fact that Hitler took the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, did that stop ambitions? No, it did not. Of course, war is unpopular. No one wants war or losses, but in fact it is already happening. As Gredis said, and I fully agree, the Third World War for global domination is already underway. The world community must take more decisive action, insist more strongly on helping Ukraine and Ukrainian prisoners, and unite to bring this war to an end by providing military aid and participation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, for energy. I'm endlessly grateful to you. I hope that we are being heard, and I hope those who died and those of you who survived and carried these wounds forever after Olenivka, this will lead to justice, to the punishment of those whom Ukrainian journalists have already investigated. They have already named those who supervised and who were the greatest in Olenivka. I believe this is only the beginning of the chain of those responsible for what happened in Olenivka prison. Thank you.
Thank you very much.